Emily Carter froze in the middle of the glittering grand ballroom at the luxury Vanguard Horizon Resort. The elegant chatter of hundreds of elite high society guests, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the soft strains of the live orchestra all faded into a sharp, suffocating silence. Her breath caught somewhere between absolute disbelief and a sudden piercing ache deep within her chest. The official document in her hand trembled against her manicured fingers. She had never intended to discover the truth like this. It was supposed to be a night of triumph, a celebration of her tech conglomerate's latest multi-billion-dollar acquisition. But a misplaced financial audit file delivered to her VIP table had shattered her reality. It was a single medical ledger, cold, authoritative, and entirely impossible to misunderstand. A $2 million specialized treatment plan for their young daughter, Lily, marked paid in full every single month for the past 2 years. The signature on every wire transfer belonged to Daniel Carter, her ex-husband. Emily blinked, staring at the name as if the ink might magically rearrange itself into something that made sense. It didn't. A wave of dizziness washed over her. The man she had divorced 3 years ago, the man she believed had quietly given up and walked away into a life of obscurity, was the one who had been carrying this astronomical burden alone. She vividly remembered those agonizing nights in the sterile private wing of the hospital, staring at the rhythmic, terrifying beeping of the heart monitors, feeling the crushing weight of helplessness. She had built a financial empire, yet her wealth couldn't bypass the experimental medical trial waiting lists. She had assumed her corporate status had unlocked the cure, but it hadn't been her power at all. While she had convinced herself that she was fighting the world entirely alone, Daniel had been standing in the shadows, silently anchoring everything. Her grip tightened, crumpling the edges of the paper. Why? The question tore through her mind with brutal force. Why would a humble, low-level charter mechanic stay silent about a multi-million-dollar life-saving miracle? Why let her believe he was a failure who couldn't provide? It felt completely unfair, a massive rewrite of the past 2 years of her life executed without her permission. Slowly, her eyes lifted, scanning the opulent ballroom. Near the grand stage stood their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, glowing in a beautiful white tulle dress, laughing as she chased a floating balloon, entirely oblivious to the fact that her mother's world had just fractured. And then Emily spotted him. Daniel was standing near the far corner of the glass pavilion, adjusting his sleeve with an aura of total composure. He wore a simple, unbranded black suit that looked neat but bore no designer labels. His expression was calm, distant, yet entirely present, a man completely unaffected by the extreme wealth and arrogance surrounding him. There was no boastfulness in his posture, no sign of guilt, and no hint that he had been harboring a secret of this magnitude. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as she began marching across the polished marble floor. The narrative she had constructed to survive their separation was disintegrating with every step. Before she could reach him, a sharp, mocking voice cut through the air. It was Julian Vance, a ruthless venture capitalist and Emily's premier business partner, standing directly in Daniel's path with a look of pure disdain. Julian sneered, deliberately raising his voice to draw the attention of the surrounding elite. He scoffed at Daniel's simple attire, demanding to know how a low-tier airfield worker managed to slip past security into a private VIP gala. Julian loudly declared that people of Daniel's stature were a stain on an elite guest list, threatening to have the resort guards throw him out onto the pavement. A collective whisper rippled through the wealthy crowd. Dozens of eyes turned toward the corner, mocking smiles forming on the faces of the onlookers. But Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive, and he didn't raise his voice. Instead, his quiet masculinity seemed to anchor the entire space. He smoothly stepped forward, shielding Lily behind his leg, his eyes locking onto Julian with a terrifyingly calm, steady gaze. When Lily whimpered, frightened by Julian's aggressive tone, Daniel instantly knelt down, scooping her up into his arms. He pressed her head gently against his shoulder, whispering soft, comforting words that instantly quieted her crying. Emily stopped just a few feet away, her breath hitching as she witnessed the profound contrast. Julian was shouting, backed by billions of dollars, yet he looked incredibly small. Daniel stood completely silent, holding his daughter with a grounded strength that money simply could not buy. Emily stepped into the circle of light, the crumpled medical receipt clutched tightly in her hand. Daniel turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. For a split second, a brief flicker of surprise crossed his face before returning to that impenetrable, calm facade. "What is this, Daniel?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking despite her desperate effort to command the room. Daniel looked down at the paper, his jaw tightening slightly as the public crowd leaned in closer, sensing a massive scandal. He shifted Lily protectively in his arms and spoke in a low, resonant tone that cut through the silence. "It's nothing you need to concern yourself with, Emily," he said quietly. Emily let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh, taking a step closer as the tension in the ballroom reached a breaking point. $2 million in secret medical bills is not nothing, Daniel. Why are you hiding this? Daniel met her gaze directly, his voice completely level. Because you weren't supposed to find out. The words seemed to hang in the air, freezing the space between them. Emily felt a sudden rush of warmth beneath her collar, a mixture of intense frustration and raw vulnerability. For 3 years, she had marched into international boardrooms, dictating terms to some of the most ruthless executives in the global tech market. She was celebrated for her calculating precision and her completely unshakable demeanor under pressure. Yet right here, under the soft, shimmering chandeliers of the Vanguard Horizon Resort, a single sentence from a man in a plain, off-the-rack suit had completely stripped away her armor. Julian Vance let out a loud, theatrical laugh, stepping closer into Emily's personal space. His eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction as he looked around at the gathering crowd of wealthy investors. "Come on, Emily," Julian sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You cannot possibly believe this ridiculous charade. Look at him." This man is a low-level line mechanic at the regional Blackwood airfield. He spends his days covered in hydraulic fluid and grease, earning a wage that wouldn't even cover the sales tax on your luxury watch. $2 million? Wired systematically every single month into a private medical account? Julian took a step toward Daniel, pointing a mocking finger at the crumpled document in Emily's hand. "Let's call it what it really is," Julian continued, raising his voice so the surrounding elite could hear every word. "It's corporate espionage, or worse, fraud. He probably used your elite status, Emily, to skim off your conglomerate's secondary accounts. A pathetic loser trying to play the anonymous savior. I'm calling security right now to have this fraud arrested." The murmurs among the high society guests grew louder. Sharp, judgment-filled glances were cast toward Daniel. People began pulling out their phones, sensing a massive corporate scandal unfolding in real time. But Daniel remained completely unmoved. His posture didn't shift by a single fraction of an inch. His breathing remained perfectly slow, perfectly steady. The chaotic noise of the wealthy crowd, the insults, the flashing phone cameras, none of it seemed to touch him. He simply stood there, a towering column of quiet masculinity, exuding a grounded confidence that made Julian's loud shouting feel incredibly desperate and hollow. Lily tightened her small arms around Daniel's neck, burying her face into the crook of his shoulder. She was trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the harsh lights and Julian's aggressive posturing. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice tiny and frightened. "The loud man is being mean. Can we go back to the hangar?" Instantly, the entire atmosphere around Daniel shifted. The distant, polite neutrality in his eyes vanished, replaced by an intensely protective, fierce focus. He adjusted his grip on his daughter, his large hand gently cradling the back of her head, shielding her entirely from the prying eyes of the crowd. "You're safe, Lily," Daniel said softly. His voice was incredibly warm, running like a soothing anchor through the tense room. "Look at me, sweetheart, just look at Daddy. Nobody is going to hurt you, I promise." It was a mesmerizing display of emotional intelligence. In a room filled with hundreds of millions of dollars, where power was measured by net worth and corporate titles, Daniel's quiet strength brought immediate peace to a terrified child. Lily's trembling stopped almost instantly. She let out a soft sigh, resting her cheek completely against his shoulder, her tiny fingers gripping his plain lapel with absolute, unwavering trust. Emily watched the interaction, a strange, painful ache tightening in her chest. She had all the wealth in the world. She could buy entire hospitals. Yet when Lily panicked, Emily often found herself freezing, gripped by an internal panic she could never quite soothe. But Daniel didn't even have to try. He simply existed, and safety followed him. The sheer contrast between her corporate power and his natural emotional security was staggering. Emily's eyes dropped back down to the crumpled ledger in her hand. Her analytical mind, temporarily blinded by shock, finally began to look at the finer details printed at the bottom of the wire transfer logs. Her breath caught. The routing numbers didn't belong to any local commercial bank. They didn't belong to any secondary corporate account of her own company. The micro print at the base of the paper bore a sleek, silver insignia, the exclusive digital stamp of the Meridian Prestige Guild. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The Meridian Prestige Guild was an ultra-elite, invitation-only sovereign banking institution. It didn't cater to millionaires. It didn't even cater to standard corporate CEOs. It was a private financial network reserved exclusively for global shadow investors, military defense legacy funds, and the true titans of international aviation and engineering. A low-wage line mechanic could not open an account there. It was physically, legally impossible. Daniel, Emily whispered, her voice losing its icy corporate edge, replaced by a sudden creeping suspicion. Where did this money actually come from? Who are you? Before Daniel could respond, the heavy mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom flew open. A tall, distinguished man in a bespoke charcoal suit hurried into the room, flanked by two senior resort executives. It was Marcus Thorne, the billionaire owner of Apex Aero Holdings and the ultimate proprietor of the Vanguard Horizon Resort itself. Julian, seeing the powerful billionaire enter, instantly smoothed his tie and stepped forward, eager to impress. "Mr. Thorne," Julian called out loudly, put on a charming, sycophantic smile. "Thank goodness you're here. We have a security breach. A common airfield mechanic has sneaked into your VIP gala and is harassing Emily Carter. I was just about to have him dragged out." Marcus Thorne stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't even look at Julian. His eyes scanned the room, landing directly on Daniel, who was still quietly holding Lily in the corner. Marcus's face went completely pale. His hands, usually steady, began to visibly tremble. He pushed past a stunned Julian, ignoring him entirely, and marched straight toward Daniel with an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. The elite crowd watched in breathless, suffocating anticipation. Julian Vance stood with a smug, self-satisfied grin playing on his lips, fully expecting the resort's elite security team to descend and violently remove the uninvited intruder from the premises. But as Marcus Thorne stepped closer to Daniel, the billionaire's usual arrogant, untouchable posture vanished entirely. His eyes were wide, fixed on Daniel with a profound level of deference and absolute shock that sent an immediate hush over the entire ballroom. Marcus stopped exactly 3 paces away, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, a visible layer of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Commander," Marcus began, his voice a gravelly, hushed whisper that barely carried over the dead silence of the room. "I had no idea you were even in the state, let alone attending an event at my resort." Daniel's eyes snapped up, sharp and piercing as polished flint. A heavy, silent command passed between the two men in an instant. Daniel subtly adjusted Lily in his arms, his large thumb gently tracing reassuring circles on her small shoulder to keep her calm. "Marcus," Daniel interrupted, his tone smooth, quiet, yet entirely unyielding. "It's been a long time. I'm just here tonight to watch my daughter enjoy the gala. There is absolutely no need for formalities." Marcus swallowed hard, visually forcing himself to recalibrate his entire demeanor. The powerful billionaire owner of a global aerospace empire looked like a nervous schoolboy caught completely out of line. "Of course," Marcus stammered, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of deep respect. "Of course, sir. I apologize for the sudden intrusion. If I had known your family was attending tonight, the entire pavilion would have been cleared for your absolute privacy." The ballroom erupted into frantic, hushed whispers. High society women clutched their diamond necklaces, and senior corporate executives exchanged bewildered, terrified glances. Julian Vance's face twisted into an expression of utter, unmitigated confusion. He took a clumsy step forward, his corporate arrogance completely overriding his survival instincts. "Mr. Thorne, with all due respect, what on earth are you doing?" Julian hissed, gesturing wildly toward Daniel. "This is Daniel Carter. He's a nobody mechanic. He works on small-scale charter props down at Blackwood Airfield. He doesn't belong in a room like this. I was just helping your security team clean up the elite guest list." Marcus Thorne turned slowly, his expression shifting from deep deference to pure, icy rage. The air in the grand hall seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. "Julian," Marcus said, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with an absolute authority that made several nearby investors flinch. "You have exactly 30 seconds to apologize to this man and his daughter. If you do not, I will personally ensure that Vance Venture Capital is permanently blacklisted from every major federal aviation contract, every international logistics corridor, and every banking syndicate from New York to London by tomorrow morning." Julian froze, his face draining of all color until he looked entirely like a ghost. He looked at Marcus, then back at Daniel, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound escaping his lips. The terrifying realization hit him like a physical blow. He had just spent the last 10 minutes publicly humiliating a man who held the strings to his entire financial existence. Emily stood completely paralyzed just a few feet away, the crumpled medical document burning a hole in her palm. Her analytical mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying desperately to stitch together the pieces of a puzzle that made absolutely no sense. She had known Daniel for a decade. They had shared a life, a home, a beautiful child. She thought he was a man who simply preferred a basic life, a quiet soul who chose the peace of a local airfield over the stressful, cutthroat nature of her corporate tech world. But the billionaire standing in front of him wasn't treating him like a simple mechanic. He was treating him like an absolute king in exile. Lily looked up from Daniel's shoulder, her large, innocent eyes taking in the pale, trembling Julian and the incredibly tense expression on Marcus's face. She didn't understand the corporate threats or the billions of dollars hanging in the balance, but she could easily feel the heavy, suffocating weight of the adult's emotions. She reached out her tiny hand and gently touched Daniel's cheek. "Daddy, why is everyone looking at us like that?" Lily asked softly, her innocent voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "Are they mad at us because we don't have a big shiny car like Mommy does?" Daniel's expression softened instantly, the cold, razor-sharp edge in his eyes melting away into pure, fierce tenderness. He kissed Lily's forehead, his voice dropping into that deep, comforting rhythm that always brought her immediate peace. "No, sweetheart," Daniel whispered, completely ignoring the hundreds of elite eyes watching his every move. "They aren't mad at us at all. They're just surprised. Remember what I told you at the airfield? The brightest lights aren't always the loudest ones." Emily stepped forward, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She couldn't take the suffocating mystery anymore. As she reached out toward Daniel, her eyes caught a small hidden detail she had completely missed during their entire marriage: a heavy, matte black titanium signet ring on Daniel's right hand, partially obscured by Lily's white dress. It bore a deeply engraved symbol, a stylized falcon wing crossed with a silver wrench, the classified emblem of the Vanguard Elite Tactical Engineering Division, an ultra-secret military skunkworks unit that designed the nation's advanced stealth aircraft. Emily felt the room spin. Before she could voice the thousand questions screaming in her mind, a sharp, urgent alarm chimed loudly from the secure satellite communicator strapped to Marcus Thorne's wrist. Marcus looked down at the flashing red display, his eyes widening in sudden, absolute terror. He looked up at Daniel, his voice trembling violently as he broke protocol. "Sir, we have a catastrophic failure," Marcus gasped, his face completely pale. "Flight 407, the private corporate transport carrying your entire former engineering team and the new atmospheric stabilizer prototype. The electronic guidance systems just completely blacked out over the mountain ridge. The pilots have lost all manual control, and the automated backup is completely unresponsive. They have less than 15 minutes before they lose total altitude." The entire ballroom gasped in collective horror. Panic instantly rippled through the wealthy guests as several people realized their own colleagues were on that doomed aircraft. Everyone froze, looking at Marcus in helpless terror. But Marcus didn't look at his emergency executives. He turned his desperate, pleading eyes directly toward Daniel. The grand ballroom fractured into absolute chaos. Billionaires, high society executives, and elite investors scrambled across the polished marble floor, phones gripped tightly to their ears, their voices rising in a pitch-black wave of panic. The comforting illusion of their untouchable wealth dissolved in a single, terrifying breath. Emily Carter felt the entire room tilt beneath her feet. Her own chief technology officer and 3 of her most brilliant senior developers were on board that exact corporate transport flight. Her multi-billion-dollar empire, her corporate acquisition, her entire net worth, none of it mattered anymore. She stared at the flashing red light on Marcus Thorne's wrist communicator, watching the countdown to disaster tick down in front of them with brutal precision. Emily's hands began to shake violently. She turned her head toward Lily, her maternal instincts colliding with her spinning executive mind. She desperately wanted to shield her daughter from the terror unfolding in the room, but her own chest was tightening so fast she could barely draw oxygen. She reached out to take Lily from Daniel's arms, but her fingers were trembling too much to hold steady. Daniel noticed immediately. He didn't say a single word, nor did he lecture her. Instead, He simply shifted his weight, his warm, solid shoulder brushing gently against hers. That single, grounded touch sent a strange, sudden wave of tranquility through Emily's body. She looked up at his face. While the most powerful people in the country were screaming and weeping around them, Daniel's face remained an absolute fortress of calm. His breathing was slow, rhythmic, and completely detached from the surrounding hysteria. Julian Vance, desperate to regain some semblance of control and authority over the situation, shoved his way past a group of crying guests. "This is absolute madness," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and lingering arrogance. "Marcus, you are asking a common airfield worker to solve a catastrophic aviation blackout? We need to call the Federal Aviation Administration immediately. We need the military. Not this grease monkey from a local hangar. He is going to get everyone on that aircraft killed trying to play the hero." Marcus Thorne didn't even have the chance to respond. Daniel slowly turned his head, shifting his gaze directly onto Julian. It wasn't an angry look, which made it infinitely more terrifying. It was the cold, clinical look of an elite operator assessing a minor, insignificant nuisance. "Julian," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that somehow carried perfectly across the immediate radius of the room. "If you speak one more word while I am trying to save 24 lives, I will have Marcus lock you in the resort's subterranean vault. Sit down and be quiet." The sheer, unyielding authority in Daniel's tone was so crushing that Julian physically recoiled. His face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson as he slunk backward into the crowd, utterly humiliated in front of the entire elite high society circle he had spent his life trying to impress. Daniel turned his full attention back to Marcus, completely dismissive of the distraction. "Patch the flight deck's encrypted emergency frequency directly into the ballroom's main audio array. Right now." Marcus scrambled frantically, his hands flying across his satellite terminal. Within seconds, a massive burst of static exploded through the ballroom's high-end surround sound speakers, followed immediately by the breathless, terrified voice of the pilot. "Vanguard Control, this is Flight 407. The speaker blared, the pilot's voice laced with sheer panic. "We have completely lost the primary and secondary flight computers. The atmospheric stabilizer prototype is locked in a hard descent attitude. The manual control columns are entirely frozen. We are losing altitude at 4,000 feet per minute. We cannot hold her." Several guests sobbed openly, clutching each other in horror. Emily covered her mouth, her eyes wide as she looked at the technical telemetry data. She knew the foundational specifications of that atmospheric stabilizer. It was a secure system designed to automatically lock down in the event of a critical digital breach, effectively turning the plane into a heavy flying brick if the automated controls failed. She looked at Daniel, her voice trembling above a whisper. "Daniel, the stabilizer is hard-coded into the fuselage aerodynamics. If the electronic guidance systems black out completely, the manual control rods lock automatically to prevent structural tearing from overcorrection. They can't override it from the cockpit. It's a completely closed loop." Daniel didn't panic. He knelt down, gently setting Lily onto a plush velvet armchair right beside Emily. He looked deep into his daughter's innocent eyes, his expression completely warm, soft, and entirely untroubled by the ticking clock. "Lily, I need you to do a very important job for me," Daniel whispered, his voice acting as a perfect shield against the noise of the room. "I need you to hold Mommy's hand tightly for a few minutes. Can you do that for me? Be my brave little co-pilot." Lily nodded solemnly, her small face filling with a profound, quiet courage as she reached out and tightly gripped Emily's shaking hand. The moment Lily's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, Emily felt a sudden shock of clarity. Her daughter wasn't looking at the weeping crowd or the flashing lights. She was looking at Daniel with absolute, unwavering certainty. Daniel stood up, his posture shifting into that of a commanding military leader. He stepped toward the central podium, his eyes locking onto the massive digital projection screen on the ballroom wall. He picked up Marcus's transceiver. "Flight 407, this is Commander Carter," Daniel spoke into the mic, his deep voice cutting through the cockpit static like a razor through silk. The cockpit audio went entirely silent for a fraction of a second. Then a voice cracked through the speakers, filled with a sudden, breathless hope that stunned every listener in the ballroom. "Commander? Sir! Thank God!" the pilot gasped. "We didn't know you were on the grid, sir. The primary digital bus is completely dead. We are flying blind into the mountain ridgeline. The manual overrides won't budge." "Listen to the sound of my voice, Captain," Daniel commanded, his calm intelligence instantly filling the terrified room. You haven't lost the computers to a system failure. The atmospheric stabilizer prototype is drawing massive power because the secondary cooling valve is jammed open, creating a severe thermal lock on the digital bus. It looks like a fatal error, but the airframe can handle it. I need you to manually trip the main circuit breaker located directly behind the co-pilot's seat, the one labeled Auxiliary Environmental Control. Sir, that will cut off all cabin pressure and the primary interior lights. The pilot panicked over the speaker. We will be in total darkness. You will be alive, Daniel countered smoothly, his tone completely unbothered by the gravity of the situation. Do it now. On my mark. The ballroom held its collective breath. Emily watched him, her mind spinning in absolute disbelief. The sheer speed at which he had diagnosed an impossible, multi-layered engineering crisis from a purely verbal description was staggering. This wasn't the work of a local airfield mechanic. This was the mind of a legendary, elite aviation genius. Suddenly, a loud, static-filled screech echoed through the speakers. The pilot's voice returned, screaming over a blaring rhythmic master caution alarm. Commander, we tripped the breaker, but the manual columns are still frozen. The nose is dipping further. We just broke through the cloud layer, and the mountain peak is directly in front of us. We have less than 2 minutes. The live radar tracking on the ballroom wall suddenly updated, showing Flight 407's trajectory dipping sharply toward a massive, jagged crimson warning zone on the topographical map. Panic erupted once more among the crowd. But Daniel didn't freeze. His eyes narrowed to sharp slits as he spotted a tiny, flickering error code at the very bottom of the raw telemetry data stream. The valve didn't jam, Daniel muttered, his voice dropping into a dark, dangerous register that made the hairs on the back of Emily's neck stand up. He looked up at the screen, his jaw tightening as a terrifying realization washed over his face. It was deliberately sabotaged. The word sabotage seemed to echo through the expansive ballroom, striking the frantic crowd with the force of a physical blow. The wealthy investors and high-ranking executives froze in their tracks, their panicked conversations dying instantly in their throats. Marcus Thorne's face went completely hollow, his eyes darting frantically from his satellite communicator to the massive digital projection screen displaying the doomed aircraft's terrifying trajectory. The crimson warning zone on the topographical map was blinking rapidly now, a digital countdown to a horrific tragedy that was less than 90 seconds away. Marcus scrambled forward, his polished leather shoes clicking loudly on the marble floor as he gripped the edge of the central podium. Sabotage? Commander, that's impossible. The security protocols for the atmospheric stabilizer prototype were handled by our highest-tier defense contractors. The encryption matrix is completely impenetrable from the outside. It wasn't breached from the outside, Daniel said, his voice deadly calm and entirely steady. He didn't look at Marcus, nor did he look at the trembling guests. His eyes remained locked onto the raw lines of telemetry data cascading down the screen, analyzing the digital anomalies with a terrifyingly fast, clinical precision. The lockdown command was planted directly into the primary firmware before takeoff. It's a logic bomb designed to masquerade as a thermal failure, specifically engineered to trap the flight crew in a permanent, unrecoverable dive. Whoever did this didn't just want to steal the prototype, they wanted to bury the entire engineering team along with it. Emily felt the breath completely leave her lungs. The sheer horror of the situation was suffocating, but what truly paralyzed her was the man standing right beside her. Daniel was speaking about classified military-grade firmware and advanced aerodynamic logic bombs as if he were reading a simple grocery list. The humble, quiet mechanic she thought she knew had completely vanished. In his place stood an absolute titan of strategic intelligence, a man who could see through a complex, multi-layered conspiracy in a matter of seconds, while a room full of billionaires fell to pieces around him. Julian Vance swallowed hard, his arrogant composure entirely shattered. He tried to speak, tried to assert his corporate dominance one last time, but his voice came out as a weak, pathetic wheeze. This is insane. If the firmware is locked down from the inside, there's nothing anyone can do. The automated systems are completely unresponsive. They're gonna crash. We are all witnessing a mass casualty event in real time. Shut your mouth, Julian, Emily snapped, her corporate mask slipping entirely, replaced by a raw, desperate fury. She didn't look at her business partner. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Daniel. She saw the tight, calculated clenching of his jaw, the absolute focus in his dark eyes. She knew that look. It was the exact same expression he wore when Lily was a baby and developed a sudden, life-threatening fever in the middle of a winter storm. Daniel hadn't panicked then, and he wasn't panicking now. He was a protector, a man who became infinitely more stable the heavier the world became. Daniel picked up the heavy transceiver, pressing the broadcast button with absolute authority. Flight 407, listen to me very carefully. The automated override codes are useless. The secondary flight bus has been corrupted by an internal cyberstrike. You cannot fight the electronic columns. You need to bypass the digital architecture entirely. Commander, we don't have a manual mechanical linkage for the stabilizer. The pilot's voice screamed through the ballroom speakers, accompanied by the terrifying, deafening roar of rushing wind and the violent rattling of the cockpit structure. The airframe is vibrating to pieces, sir. We are less than 800 feet from the mountain face. We can see the trees through the cockpit window. There is no manual bypass. There is a bypass, Daniel commanded, his voice expanding through the grand hall like a wave of pure thunder, instantly cutting through the pilot's hysteria. The primary design schematic for the Vanguard series airframe includes an emergency mechanical tether located beneath the floorboards of the main galley. It's a legacy safety system designed for extreme combat scenarios. It bypasses every single digital wire in the fuselage and forces a physical pneumatic pressure release to the elevator flaps. The speakers went completely silent for a fraction of a second, save for the blaring master caution alarms. The pilot sounded entirely breathless, gripped by a sudden shocking realization. Sir, that tether is a classified sovereign asset. Only the master architect of the original Defense Skunkworks framework would even know that system exists. Who is this? Just pull the tether, Captain, Daniel ordered, his calm voice cracking with a sudden, fierce urgency that made the entire ballroom hold its breath. Open the galley deck plate, sever the secure yellow seal, and yank the mechanical release lever with everything you have. But sir, the co-pilot's voice broke through the static, weeping openly now. The pneumatic bay is protected by an analog alphanumeric vault lock. We don't have the master security key. It requires a 7-digit override code assigned by the original lead engineer of the Vanguard program. We don't have it in our emergency manuals. Marcus Thorne dropped to his knees behind the podium, burying his face in his hands. It's over, the billionaire muttered, his voice hollow and broken. The lead engineer of the Vanguard program went entirely off the grid 3 years ago. The master key codes are completely sealed in a high-security military archive in Washington. No one here can access them in time. They have less than 40 seconds before impact. Emily watched as Daniel slowly closed his eyes. The entire ballroom seemed to shrink down until it was just him, standing in the center of a chaotic universe, carrying the weight of 24 innocent lives entirely on his shoulders. He took a single, deep breath, and when he opened his eyes, he looked directly at Lily, who was still sitting quietly on the velvet armchair, holding Emily's hand with absolute, unshakable trust. Daniel raised the transceiver to his mouth, his voice dropping into a clear, steady, and incredibly emotional cadence. Captain, enter the master override key now, Daniel said, speaking the numbers with absolute certainty. November 061117. Emily froze, her heart stopping completely. Her eyes widened in absolute staggering shock as the specific numbers left Daniel's lips. November represented the month. Then came the exact date and year, 06/11/17. November 6th, 2017. It was Lily's birthday. The master security code for the nation's most advanced, highly classified military aviation defense system was the exact date and time their daughter had been born into the world. The realization hit Emily like a tidal wave, crushing her corporate pride into absolute dust. Daniel wasn't just a brilliant mechanic who had quietly helped pay some medical bills. He was the legendary, completely anonymous master architect of the entire global aerospace framework. He had designed the very skies they flew in, and he had protected his family by weaving his love for their daughter into the very fabric of the nation's highest defense infrastructure. On the massive projection screen, the live radar tracking dot representing Flight 407 reached the absolute edge of the jagged Crimson Mountain peak. The audio feed from the cockpit erupted into a massive, deafening screech of tearing metal and rushing air, followed by a sudden, terrifying explosion of static that cut the connection completely dead. A dead, suffocating silence fell over the grand ballroom of the Vanguard Horizon Resort. The sharp static hiss from the high-end surround sound speakers rung out like a funeral knell, vibrating against the crystal chandeliers. On the massive projection screen, the live radar tracking dot representing Flight 407 remained completely stationary at the very edge of the jagged crimson peak. It didn't move. It didn't update. Emily Carter felt her knees completely buckle. The powerful, untouchable CEO who had built a multi-billion-dollar tech empire from scratch was entirely gone. In her place stood a terrified woman, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the cold reality of the crash threatened to swallow her whole. Her chief technology officer, her friends, her brilliant developers, 24 lives had seemingly vanished into the dark mountain ridge. She squeezed Lily's tiny hand so tightly her own knuckles turned completely white, her vision blurring with a sudden rush of helpless tears. The elite high society crowd was paralyzed. Several wealthy investors dropped to their knees, their luxury phones slipping from their fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. Women wept openly, burying their faces in their husbands' designer tuxedos. Julian Vance staggered backward against a catered champagne table, his face entirely devoid of color, his chest heaving as his mind frantically processed the catastrophic corporate fallout of what he had just witnessed. "They're gone," someone whispered from the back of the room, the words hanging like ice in the air. "They're all gone." But Daniel didn't move a muscle. He stood like a towering fortress of granite in the center of the chaotic room. While everyone else fell to pieces, his breathing remained perfectly rhythmic, perfectly slow. He didn't look at the weeping billionaires, and he didn't look at the frozen radar screen. Instead, he calmly walked over to the plush velvet armchair, knelt down directly in front of Emily and Lily, and gently placed his large, warm hand over both of their shaking fingers. "Breathe, Emily," Daniel said softly. His deep, resonant voice wasn't a whisper of defeat, it was a calm, steady command that cut through her internal panic like an absolute anchor. "Look at me. Just breathe." Emily looked up, her eyes wide and swimming with tears, her voice cracking with raw vulnerability. "Daniel," the radio went dead. The tracking dot stopped. They hit the mountain. "They didn't hit the mountain," Daniel replied, his expression entirely untroubled, his quiet masculinity radiating an unshakable confidence that made her heart slow its frantic beating. Watch the secondary satellite relay on the lower dashboard. The primary radar array always cuts out when the pneumatic bypass discharges its high-pressure nitrogen vapor. It blinds the regional tracking towers for exactly 10 seconds. Give it a moment. Exactly 9 seconds later, a sharp, metallic beep echoed violently through the ballroom speakers. On the massive projection screen, the live tracking dot suddenly jumped, blinking back to life. It wasn't behind the mountain peak, it was soaring high above it, climbing at an incredibly steep, triumphant vertical angle, leaving the jagged crimson danger zone far behind, as it moved steadily into the bright blue safety grid. Instantly, the audio feed exploded back to life with a deafening roar of engine power, followed immediately by the breathless, euphoric sobbing of the flight crew. "Vanguard Control, we are clear." The pilot screamed into his mic, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated joy. The elevator flaps responded. "We pulled the mechanical tether and cleared the mountain ridge by less than 50 feet. Manual pneumatic control is fully operational. The airframe is stable, and we are holding an altitude of 9,000 feet. Commander, whoever you are, you just saved 24 lives. Thank God." The entire ballroom erupted into an absolute frenzy. Billionaires who had been weeping seconds ago began cheering at the top of their lungs, hugging one another in absolute disbelief. Senior executives clapped frantically, tears of sheer relief streaming down their faces. The heavy, suffocating cloud of terror that had gripped the high society elite dissolved into a massive wave of pure celebration. But the celebration quickly shifted. One by one, the cheers began to die down into a stunned, reverent quiet. The hundreds of wealthy guests slowly turned their heads, their eyes locking with absolute awe and profound respect onto the far corner of the glass pavilion, toward the man in the plain, unbranded black suit. Marcus Thorne slowly rose from his knees behind the central podium. The powerful billionaire owner of a global aerospace empire looked completely transformed. The corporate arrogance and polished exterior were gone, replaced by the humble reverence of a man standing in the presence of a living legend. He walked out from behind the stage, completely ignoring a trembling Julian Vance, and marched straight across the marble floor toward Daniel. When Marcus reached him, he stopped exactly 2 paces away. He didn't offer a corporate handshake. Instead, the powerful billionaire brought his feet together, stood at absolute attention, and delivered a deep, formal, military bow. "Thank you, Commander," Marcus said, his gravelly voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. The global aerospace defense market believed the Vanguard Ghost had retired into permanent exile 3 years ago. "We had no idea the master architect of our nation's skies was walking among us tonight. My company, my resort, and the lives of my entire engineering team owe you an unpayable debt." The revelation hit the remaining crowd like a physical shockwave. The elite guests stared at Daniel, their mouths open in utter astonishment. The very man they had spent the evening mocking, the man Julian Vance had called a low-tier grease monkey and a security risk, was the legendary military engineering genius who held the classified master keys to the country's entire aviation infrastructure. Julian Vance looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He stood frozen by the champagne table, his face flushing a deep, humiliated crimson, as dozens of elite eyes turned toward him with pure, unmitigated disgust. His corporate status, his venture capital wealth, his entire high society standing had just been utterly obliterated by his own staggering stupidity. He had tried to humiliate a king, only to expose himself as a completely insignificant peasant. Emily stood up slowly, her body trembling as she looked at Daniel. The analytical, cold corporate walls she had built around her heart for the past 3 years had completely shattered into dust. She looked down at Lily, then back up at Daniel's calm, handsome face. "November 6th, Emily whispered, her voice barely above a breath, yet carrying an immense weight of emotional realization. "The master override key. The code to save the most advanced defense system in the world was her birthday." Daniel slowly stood up from the floor, adjusting his plain suit jacket as he met her eyes. The cold, razor-sharp focus of the elite military commander dissolved instantly, returning to the warm, quiet father she had always known. He didn't look at the bowing billionaire, and he didn't spare a single glance toward the ruined Julian Vance. He simply looked at Emily, his voice dropping into a low, profoundly gentle register. "I told you, Emily," Daniel said softly, stepping closer to ensure his daughter felt entirely safe. "I didn't do any of this for recognition. I did it because when the world falls apart, my family is the only thing that matters." Lily smiled brightly, her small arms reaching up toward him. Daniel instantly scooped her up, cradling her against his chest as the elite crowd began to applaud, a thunderous wave of public admiration washing over them. But as Emily watched Daniel hold their daughter, she noticed a shadow of intense gravity cross his face as he glanced down at the raw data streaming on Marcus's terminal. The digital trail of the sabotage wasn't finished. It was tracing back to a server located directly inside the ballroom. The thunderous applause from the high society guests filled the cavernous glass pavilion, but for Emily, the sound felt muted, as if she were standing underwater. Her eyes remained locked on Daniel. The realization that he had encoded their daughter's birthday into the ultimate defense system of the United States military was a weight that crushed whatever remaining corporate pride she possessed. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that she was the practical one, the builder, the anchor of their fractured family. She had looked down on his quiet lifestyle, viewing his choice to work at a sleepy regional airfield as a sign of surrendered ambition. Now, the truth stood before her, towering and undeniable. Daniel hadn't surrendered his ambition. He had surrendered his entire identity, his legendary legacy, and his multi-billion-dollar worth just to give their daughter a quiet, normal life away from the dangerous, cutthroat shadows of the military-industrial complex. And when Lily had fallen ill, he hadn't wavered. He had quietly tapped into his hidden sovereign network, depleting his own heavily guarded resources to pay every single medical bill in total secrecy, never asking for a single word of gratitude. Marcus Thorne stepped closer to Daniel, his face tight with a sudden, dark gravity. "Commander," he whispered, gesturing toward the secondary terminal screen that was still pulsing with localized digital data. "Look at this. The encryption matrix shows the logic bomb wasn't triggered from an overseas server. The digital handshake that initiated the system blackout was authorized by a physical device currently connected to our private VIP network right here in this room." The surrounding executives, still celebrating the survival of Flight 407, fell silent once more as they noticed the shift in the billionaire's demeanor. The air in the ballroom grew thick with a renewed sense of danger. Daniel didn't show surprise. His face remained an unshakable mask of calculated focus. He gently squeezed Lily's shoulder, keeping her tucked safely behind him, and stepped up to the main digital podium. His fingers moved across the interface with an effortless, fluid speed that left Marcus's senior tech team staring in absolute awe. He didn't speak a word of complex code. He simply isolated the active transmission signal, tracing the physical hardware address of the saboteur. On the massive projection wall, a dynamic architectural map of the grand ballroom flickered into view. A bright, pulsing amber beam originated from the podium and shot directly across the digital grid, tracing a straight line toward a specific table near the champagne fountain. The beam stopped, locking onto a single, glowing coordinate. Every head in the room turned in unison. Standing at that exact coordinate was Julian Vance. On the white linen tablecloth right in front of him rested a sleek, military-grade encrypted tablet, its screen still flashing with the active command strings of the automated system lockdown. Julian froze. The final remnants of his arrogant high society facade cracked, leaving his face completely deformed by terror. He looked down at his tablet, then up at the hundreds of accusing eyes staring at him with absolute horror. "Julian," Emily breathed, her voice shaking with an intense, freezing fury. "You did this? You tried to kill 24 of our own people?" Julian staggered backward, knocking over a crystal vase that shattered violently on the marble floor. "No, this is a setup," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Marcus, you can't believe this. This grease monkey is manipulating the resort's network to frame me. Why would I destroy the prototype? My firm invested $50 million into Apex Aero Holdings. Because the failure of the prototype would trigger a massive, catastrophic clause in our federal contract," Marcus Thorne growled, his voice vibrating with absolute rage as he stepped forward. "A clause that would force my company into a hostile restructuring, allowing Vance Venture Capital to buy out my entire aerospace empire for pennies on the dollar. You didn't just want the prototype, Julian. You wanted to hijack the entire national logistics grid, and you didn't care how many bodies you had to bury to get it." Julian's eyes darted frantically toward the exit doors, his mind clearly racing for an escape. But before he could take a single step, Daniel's deep, booming voice echoed across the silent hall, instantly freezing him in place. "You're not going anywhere, Julian," Daniel said. His tone wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, absolute authority that made several nearby security guards instantly draw their tasers. "You made a fatal miscalculation. You assumed the master architect of the Vanguard system was dead. You thought you could manipulate the skies for your own petty greed." Daniel stepped away from the podium, his posture radiating the quiet, lethal masculinity of a decorated combat veteran. He walked slowly toward Julian, the crowd automatically parting to give him a wide, respectful berth. "You targeted a flight carrying my former engineering team," Daniel continued, stopping exactly 3 feet from the trembling billionaire. "You frightened my daughter. And you brought your corporate warfare into the space where my family stands." Julian fell to his knees, utterly broken, weeping openly as the realization of his complete ruin washed over him. "I'm sorry. Please, Daniel. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Daniel replied coldly, looking down at him with pure disdain. "That's your defect, Julian. You only show respect when you think someone has the power to destroy you. You treat the rest of the world like garbage." Daniel turned his head slightly toward Marcus Thorne. "Call the federal authorities. Tell them the Vanguard Ghost has a high-tier asset waiting for them in the lobby." Instantly, 4 heavily armed resort tactical guards descended on Julian, hoisting the weeping venture capitalist off the floor and dragging him out through the side doors in absolute public humiliation. The elite crowd watched in stunned silence as one of the most powerful financial figures in the country was removed like a common criminal. As the doors clicked shut, a profound quiet settled over the room. Marcus Thorne turned back to Daniel, offering a deep, respectful nod before quietly gesturing for the remaining guests to clear the pavilion, giving the family the absolute privacy they deserved. Within minutes, the grand ballroom was empty, save for the 3 of them. The soft, ambient lights cast long, warm shadows across the polished marble. Emily walked forward slowly, her hands trembling as she stopped in front of Daniel. The corporate armor she had worn like a shield for years had completely dissolved. She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, her heart aching with a profound mix of regret and reawakened admiration. "Daniel, I'm so sorry," Emily whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "I spent 3 years believing you had given up on us. I thought you didn't care. I thought I was entirely alone in that hospital wing. Daniel looked down at her, his expression softening completely. The cold, razor-sharp edge of the military commander vanished, replaced entirely by the gentle, protective man she had married. He reached out, his large, warm hand gently wiping a stray tear from her cheek. "You were never alone, Emily," Daniel said softly. "I chose the silence because my world was dangerous. The people I fought, the systems I designed, they create targets. I let you walk away because I thought if you were distant from me, you and Lily would be safe from the shadows. But I never stopped watching over you, not for a single second." Lily reached out her small hands, wrapping one around Daniel's wrist and the other around Emily's fingers, drawing her parents together in a tight, unbroken circle of warmth. "Mommy? Daddy?" Lily said, her innocent face glowing with absolute happiness. "Can we go home together now?" Emily looked up into Daniel's dark eyes, sensing a faint, undeniable spark of reawakened romance and mutual respect passing between them. The broken pieces of their past hadn't vanished, but a new, unshakable foundation had just been poured beneath their feet. "Yes, sweetheart," Emily said, her voice filled with a deep, profound peace as she locked eyes with Daniel. "We're going home. Together." The cool, crisp night air of the Vanguard Horizon Resort washed over them as the heavy glass doors of the pavilion slid shut behind them. Outside, the private executive helipad overlooked the shimmering skyline of the city, the distant lights twinkling like a field of fallen stars. Daniel walked steadily, carrying a fast-asleep Lily cradled gently against his shoulder. Her small breathing was rhythmic, a soft, comforting sound against the quiet backdrop of the midnight sky. Emily walked closely beside him, her high-heeled steps echoing softly on the pristine concrete. For the first time in 3 long years, the heavy, crushing weight of corporate worry had completely vanished from her shoulders. Before they could reach the waiting luxury transport, the silhouette of Marcus Thorne appeared near the edge of the tarmac. The powerful aerospace billionaire was holding a sleek silver sovereign data tablet. His expression was no longer tense or fearful. It was filled with the profound satisfaction of absolute justice served. He stepped forward, stopping a respectful distance away out of deference to the sleeping child. "Commander," Marcus said, his voice low and rich with admiration, "the federal authorities have officially processed Julian Vance. His encrypted devices have been completely stripped by our cybersecurity team. The evidence of his treason and sabotage is absolute, but there is one final piece of business that requires your authorization." Daniel paused, turning his head slightly. His quiet masculinity remained entirely unshakable, a stark contrast to the frantic world of global finance that Marcus represented. "What is it, Marcus?" Marcus tapped the silver screen, bringing up a secure digital ledger bearing the golden crest of the Meridian Prestige Guild. When Julian Vance attempted to sabotage Flight 407, he put his entire venture capital firm up as collateral for the automated short position trade against your conglomerate, Emily, Marcus explained, turning his gaze toward her with a warm smile. Because the aircraft safely cleared the mountain ridge due to the commander's manual override, Julian's market position didn't just fail, it suffered a total catastrophic liquidation. His entire multi-billion-dollar corporate empire collapsed in a matter of seconds. Emily gasped, her hand automatically rising to her mouth as her executive mind quickly processed the staggering scale of the financial reversal. That means his shares, his entire controlling interest in my tech conglomerate, are currently sitting in a blind sovereign trust. Marcus nodded, his eyes shifting back to Daniel. A trust that was quietly funded and secured by the Meridian Prestige Guild exactly 2 hours ago. Commander, you systematically bought out Julian's entire liquidated portfolio the moment his malicious code breached the network. You didn't just save those 24 lives in the sky. You took total control of the entire financial market. Marcus slid a glowing digital stylus from the side of the tablet and extended it toward Daniel. You now hold the absolute, undisputed majority ownership of Vance Venture Capital and the sovereign oversight of Emily's conglomerate. The entire infrastructure of the modern tech market belongs to you. Daniel looked down at the tablet for a single, silent moment. The immense wealth, the global leverage, the power to dictate the future of international trade, none of it caused even a flicker of greed in his steady eyes. He didn't take the stylus. Instead, he gently shifted Lily's sleeping form, ensuring she remained completely warm against his chest, and looked directly at Emily. "Give the entire portfolio to Emily," Daniel said softly, his deep voice carrying a wave of pure, selfless devotion. Emily froze, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. "Daniel, no, that's billions of dollars. That's the entire sovereign network you spent your life building. I can't accept that. Daniel stepped closer, the soft amber lights of the helipad illuminating the gentle, fiercely protective lines of his face. He reached out, his large, warm fingers gently closing around her hand, guiding her fingers to take the stylus from Marcus. "I never cared about the billions, Emily," Daniel whispered, his tone filled with an emotional depth that brought immediate tears to her eyes. "I built the Vanguard framework to protect this nation. I built the sovereign accounts to ensure that no matter what happened to me, our daughter would never have to suffer. You built an empire to change the world, but you were constantly forced to answer to ruthless men like Julian. Now, you don't answer to anyone. You are the sole, absolute ruler of your own destiny. My only job is to keep you both safe." Marcus Thorne let out a breath of profound respect, bowing his head deeply as Emily signed the digital ledger. With a final, reverent nod to the legendary commander, the billionaire stepped back into the shadows, leaving the family entirely alone beneath the wide canopy of the night sky. Emily looked down at the signed document, then up at the man who had secretly anchored her entire existence from the shadows. The cold, calculated walls of her corporate persona had completely dissolved, replaced by a raw, beautiful vulnerability. She stepped into his space, her hand resting against his solid chest, feeling the steady, unshakable beat of his heart. 3 years ago, I thought leaving was the only way to find strength," Emily whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of regret and reawakened romance. "I thought your silence meant you didn't want to fight for us. I was so incredibly blind, Daniel." Daniel smiled, a rare, breathtaking expression of warmth that smoothed away the exhaustion of his hidden past. He leaned down, his forehead gently resting against hers, his quiet masculinity enveloping her in a sense of absolute emotional security that money could never buy. "You didn't need to find strength, Emily," Daniel said softly. "You already had it. I just needed to build a sky safe enough for you to fly in. The silence is over. I'm not going anywhere." Lily stirred slightly in his arms, her long eyelashes fluttering open as she looked between her mother and father. A beautiful, pure smile spread across her small face as she noticed her mother's hand resting securely inside her father's grip. "Are we a real team again, Daddy?" Lily whispered sleepily, her tiny fingers tangling in Daniel's plain lapel. Daniel kissed her forehead, his arm wrapping tightly around Emily's waist, drawing them together into a single, unbreakable circle of warmth and redemption. "Yes, sweetheart," Daniel replied, his deep voice echoing with an absolute certainty that promised a beautiful, unwritten future. "We are a team for the rest of our lives."